from overseas. This is the American trillion. The American trillion is 1 million million. And I understand in some other countries a trillion is defined differently. But this is the American trillion. 1 million million dollars times 2.3. That is a very large sum of money. Thank you for the sound. It sounds like we have some volume here. Can you hear me now better? Okay. Well, my research indicates he made these comments on September 10th. And then the next day, the plane slammed into the Twin Towers, and something happened at the Pentagon, and all hell broke loose, and here we are. And this story got buried. It surfaced in January, the following January, briefly, which is where I picked it up. And there you go. It's basically not discussed by the mainstream news media at this point, not to any meaningful extent. Next slide. And then we have the very interesting memoirs of Bill Goley, who worked 11 years in the White House for 4 different administrations, starting in the 60s and running up, starting in the Carter L.B. Lyndon Baines Johnson administration, and running up to the first part of the Carter administration. He worked for most of that time in one capacity or another with something called the military office. Now, I hadn't read of the military office or knew much of anything about it until I happened to pick up this book. The military office works out of the White House. It essentially is an office that puts at the president's sole discretion a slush fund of unknown millions of dollars to use as he sees fit, in secrecy, without any congressional oversight. The president proposes and the military office disposes. That's the way it works. Is that constitutional? I don't think so, but that's the way it works. So anyway, Bill Goley worked in these capacities in the White House, and can we have the next frame, please? And in his book, he has a very great many fascinating things to say, but I wanted to extract just a few of the sentences where I feel he got right down to the meat of the matter. Basically, the military office makes it possible for the president to do the things he needs or wants to do, whether they're covert or for all the world to see. It's no exaggeration to say it's the president's Aladdin's lamp. There's nothing that can't be done, and there's a bottomless pit of money, ingenuity, and resources to do it with. Is that clear? Is there anyone here who does not understand that? That's at least since the 1960s, and quite possibly before that. I'm guessing it was that way before that. Maybe for a long time before that. How much money are we talking about here? Who knows? Bill Goley's not telling, for obvious reasons, which he sets out in his book. Next please. But he goes on to say that a lot of this money was lavished, judging from his comments in his book back in the 1950s and 60s already, on scores of very deeply buried presidential command bunkers sprinkled around the country. And he talks here about not only the number, but the high degree of classification, that they're very deep, and that the money for this, look at the bottom, was in the sole control of the military office at the White House. Look at the very last clause, a couple of clauses. It was channeled through a circuitous route the cleverest spy or accountant would have trouble following. In other words, he's talking about a shell game. You can't find that money. It doesn't exist. The cleverest spy, and I believe he was in a position to know a good number of clever spies, or accountant, and a man in his position would certainly have known a lot of bean counters, couldn't find it. So this is just one source. Next slide, please. And authorization to spend the money, although it was allocated to the Army, was given to the Navy. Now you see it, now you don't. Specifically, the Chesapeake Division Navy Engineers. The Navy, eh? You'll see a little later why I think that's interesting. The Navy has its thumb on this secret slush fund for building deep, multiple scores, sophisticated deep underground facilities. And I want to touch briefly on this question of national security under which so much of this activity has been carried out. No, people who are secure aren't worried about hiding. If you feel really secure, you're not worried about hiding. You're not worried about concealing millions and billions of dollars. This has to do with profound insecurity. People who are really deeply scared, and I mean deeply scared, want to go deep underground because they know better than anyone else what they are up to. And if what they are up to is so deeply dangerous that they need to be thousands of feet underground, and that's where they're going to go without telling the likes of you and me. And I've had to dig a little bit for this information. This is not an obscure book, I mean, in the sense that you can't get it, but it's... Raise your hand if anyone in this room has ever read this book or heard about it before now. One out of 100 people. And me. But I was in this research for several years before I heard of it. Let's go to the next slide. Then there are other agencies. We heard about the Executive Office of the President, in other words, the White House, or is the military office part of the Pentagon? See, we're in a no man's land there, a gray world, in the black world, where things happen and no one's accountable. But vast sums of money vanish completely into very deep, high-tech holes in the ground. Well, let's look at another federal agency, HUD, for example. I was recently struck by the fact that there was an audit done about in the year 2000 or so of HUD that was covered in these hearings in the year 2000 in the Congress. And it turns out $59 billion could not be found by the auditors at HUD. The accountants went through the books, and at the end of it all they said, right, where are the missing $59 billion? Well, they weren't there. But don't you be late with your check to the IRS and account for every nickel. Next slide, please. But you see, it's not just the Pentagon, it's not just the White House, it's not just HUD, it's NASA. I got this off the internet just last week. USA Today ran this little story, and it was in the news one day, and then bang, it's gone. You see these little items pop up, except they're not really little items. Look at this. I just extracted this one sentence. NASA failed to account for billions of dollars spent on the Space Shuttle and International Space Station. This is from a General Accounting Office report. Next slide, please. So, for all of those who think there's something fishy going on at NASA, that there might be, covert operations, well, guess what? Maybe so. And where does the money come from to fund those possible covert operations? Well, there you have the GAO telling you through a story on USA Today last week, there are billions of dollars. They send in their bean counters, and they say, well, where's the money? NASA couldn't definitively say. And then there are the Native Americans who've been kicked in the teeth and worse for a long time, and are still they're down on the ground and getting stomped on to this day. There's something called the Native American Trust Fund, which was established way back in the 19th century. The idea was, well, the continent is based, most of it, 90-some% of it. Go right ahead. By the way, this is Ted, and he's doing a wonderful job. These difficulties are not Ted's fault. In fact, things wouldn't be happening as well as they are happening now were it not for Ted. So I want to give him another round of applause. So the idea was that since all of this real estate was taken from Native Americans, that at least the lands that did remain to them, the petroleum that's drilled, the timber that's felled, the fish that are taken, the furs, the gold that's mined, etc., the copper, whatever, that the Indians would get a percentage of this, and it would go into a trust fund and then be dispersed to the different tribes and nations and go out to the members, the individual Native Americans that way, and they would get their due. That's not happening. And it is not happening in a major way. What's happening is the money is, from what I can see, being looted. By whom? Well, see, that's the question. The Indians have been trying to find out for years. And here's just one article I pulled off the internet from the Washington Post, and another one from Insight Magazine. I think Insight Magazine is published by the Washington Times. Is that right? Does anyone know? Yes. Okay. So here you have from the Post and Insight Mag. They and other major newspapers and minor newspapers and a variety of websites have carried this information in recent years. No one disputes that there are billions of missing dollars. And no one disputes that no one can say just where those dollars are and who has them. No one furthermore disputes that the Indians haven't got those billions of dollars. So there's a crime in progress, and it's a big one. I've seen figures that run anywhere from the low billions, maybe the $5 or $10 billion range, up to the $100 billion range. Maybe it's more than $100 billion. Maybe it's $500 billion. No one knows. You can't tell me it's not $500 billion. No one can. You can't tell me it's only $1 billion. It's a massive crime. For sure, major officers of the United States government are involved in it up to their neck. Corporations, we're talking about the black budget again here. The money goes in to the Department of the Interior, Bureau of Indian Affairs, to the Native American Trust Fund, and it vanishes. By the way, if you ever look at a map of the West, Indian territory covers large tracts of real estate, and you have major corporations running major mining operations on a number of those tribes. Strikes me that'd be a good cover to make clandestine underground facilities, using perhaps the wealth that you're stealing from the Indians to do it. Let's go next slide, please. So here's the bottom line for the black budget. The scale of the theft is mind-boggling. The size of the black budget is astronomical. Money is obviously not a problem if you have secret projects and programs you want to carry out. I've just showed you from the public record. In aggregate, we're dealing with trillions of dollars right here. The actual figure, dollar amount, is likely to be much larger if that's what you can find out with an easy first cut at the public record. That'd be my view. Next slide, please. So I've established, I hope to your satisfaction, that there are huge amounts of money in the black budget, vast amounts of money, to carry out large civil engineering projects, among others. Now I want to talk about compartmentalization. So you have the money. You want to make secret, clandestine, underground facilities. How are you going to do that secretly to keep people from knowing? Well, you can't absolutely hide a large underground project or civil construction project, but you can disguise it in a sense, maybe hide it in plain sight. Next slide, please. The best explanation I have seen for how compartmentalization works comes right out of the horse's mouth. Next slide, please. From a man named John Pena Craven. He's actually has a doctor in oceanography. He had a very important position for the United States Navy during the height of the Cold War. He was a research scientist in charge of their Special Projects Office for their Undersea Division. And he authored a book called The Silent War. I highly recommend it to you. It came out 2 or 3 years ago, I guess. 3 years ago, and I've read it. It was fascinating to me. Let's go to the next slide, please. In that book, he shows how or he cites as an example how the Polaris program served as cover for a very secret program called Sand Dollar, which was designed to recover sensitive military hardware and technology from the ocean floor. Now, obviously, that covers the waterfront. Sensitive military technology. That could be stuff from the Russians or the Red Chinese or someone like that, or conceivably it could be Roswell type of debris that came down at sea. I'm not saying it is, but I'm saying that occurred to me as a possibility while I was reading the book. But anyway, his example, the Polaris submarine program. The Polaris was the first generation of nuclear missile firing submarine that the United States Navy had back in the 50s and 60s. But was open program number one. You could read about the Polaris submarines in the newspaper and see it on TV. That served as cover for a secret program number two, and program number two served as cover for program number three, which was the so-called Sand Dollar program. Go on the next slide, please. So you didn't read about Sand Dollar in your newspaper. You read about the Polaris program. But people that worked in the Sand Dollar program would have had the Polaris program as a cover for their activities, and then there was a second program intermediary in between there. Next slide, please. And he points out that recovering this hardware was a task that they carried out not only on the continental shelves, but in a deep sea, mid-ocean environment as well. And in order to do that, they needed to develop a new generation of technology, enabling them to go very deep down, many hundreds and even thousands of feet, to put divers physically down in the water at very great depth, and also to design submersibles that could go down thousands of feet. Next slide, please. And the people involved in this program had such an extraordinary degree of security that their clearances required them to not even discuss what they did with their families, their associates, their friends, their colleagues. So you would have a husband who would go to work and maybe go to sea on a Polaris submarine, for example, and do something else. Bye, honey, I'll be back in 6 months. I'm at sea. Well, guess what? Maybe not. Or, honey, you know, I work at the Pentagon and I'm working on the Polaris program. Maybe not. Maybe not working on Polaris. Or maybe don't tell your wife anything at all. Maybe your wife wouldn't even know you're working for the Navy. Maybe your wife wouldn't even know you were working. I don't know. Anyway, the cover is extreme, and he makes that very clear in his remarks. That people who work in this degree of secrecy do it in such a manner that even blood relatives, people that live in the same house with them, don't know what they're doing because it's a condition of their clearance that they don't tell them. You in this room who are married, perhaps to someone who works for the feds, you really know what your spouse does? It's no guarantee. Not at all. And you think your marital vow is stronger than that? I'm telling you, it's not. Because you sign your life away when you go on these programs. Next slide, please. Well, as I said, to get down deep, they needed new technology. And I want to mention in passing that if there are 3 levels of secrecy, which he described in his book, what's to prevent a 4th level or a 5th level? What John Pena Craven is doing, and you have to understand when you read books by people like him, is that I've never met the man personally, but I think if you read his book with your eyes open and your mind turned on, that you'll get the point he's making, that there are secrets within secrets. Clearly that could extend the subject matter of this conference, and I'll give you an indication of what I'm talking about in a little bit. But it could certainly, for example, a 4th level of security could have to do with undersea and underground bases, and I'll get to that very shortly. A 5th level could conceivably have to do with extraterrestrials. I'm not saying it does. I'm saying I strongly suspect that it does. Appreciate the difference. I cannot conclusively prove to you that there are extraterrestrials underground or undersea. But I can tell you I wouldn't be surprised if there are. Next slide, please. Well, I talked about new technology, more powerful technology, more sophisticated technology. Tunnel boring machines have been developed and used extensively in the last decades, since the 50s basically. And this is an example of a military tunnel boring machine. This photo is from 1982 in Nevada. And this machine was owned and operated by the Air Force. I presume there are other military tunnel boring machines. This is the only photo of one my research has found so far. But having found this one photo, I've proved the principle. Let's go on to the next one, please. Now, understand that this technology is deployed by a variety of major corporations and government agencies for underground excavation and tunneling. One of those agencies is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And the Deputy Director of Engineering and Construction for the Army Corps of Engineers in the 1980s made a speech on the public record at a seminar at MIT in Boston, where he said, several of the most interesting facilities that have been designed and constructed by the Corps are classified. And the context of his remarks had to do with underground construction. The entire conference he was speaking at had that theme. And he goes on to say, as stated earlier in his remarks, there are other projects of similar scope to the NORAD base in Colorado, which I cannot identify, but which included multiple chambers of up to 50 feet wide and 100 feet high, using the same excavation procedures mentioned for the NORAD facility. And here's the kicker. Because of the critical and unusual nature of these projects, there were often a large number of consultants and Corps staff involved during design and construction. The critical and unusual nature of these projects. Next slide, please. Which he can't talk about, which I'm going to allude to. Here's what I think he meant. I think he meant what John Pena Craven was alluding to. By implication, that is, another level of security beyond the sand dollar program. Next slide, please. In 1969, a report came out of the Stanford Research Institute in Menlo Park, California. And the title of it was The Feasibility of Manned In-Bottom Bases. And next slide, please. This report went on to say the construction of 30 manned in-bottom bases within the ocean floors is technically and economically feasible. This is in the 1960s. The cost of such a base program will be about $2.7 billion. And I just showed you over $2 trillion in the black budget unaccounted for. You could, for that amount of money, you could make thousands of them. Go ahead, please. And they go on to say, in a note, that they wish to acknowledge the basic data and cooperation of the Naval Undersea Warfare Center at China Lake. That's the Navy's weapons and research station at China Lake, California. Go ahead, please. Which is interesting because this document came out of that same place at China Lake 3 years before the document I've just shown you, discussing that very thing, so-called rock site planning document, talking about manned undersea bases as much as hundreds of miles offshore, connected by hundreds of miles of tunnels, actually tunneled down beneath the seafloor, well out to sea. Next slide, please. This illustration I got from Walt Kirshner. Walt Kirshner was an illustrator for this program, this rock site program, back in the 1960s. I appeared on the George Noory Show. I assume some of you listen to the George Noory Show. It's a talk radio show in the middle of the night. And back in the fall of last year, and Walt Kirshner happened to be listening that night. He's an elderly gentleman, and he stays up at night and listens to talk radio like millions of other people. And he happened to hear my interview, and he contacted me and said, I worked with a program that was, planning these types of facilities, and I did some artwork for them. Would you be interested in seeing it? And I said, well, of course. And so he sent it to me, and I wrote back and said, this is wonderful. Do you mind if I publicize this? And he said, by all means. So, courtesy of Walt Kirshner, and he's a gifted artist, we see a rock site facility. On the left, you can see that's actually a docking bay deep underwater for a submarine. And it comes in through that huge airlock. You can see it on the left-hand side. There it comes. It'll go in and dock. And then you can see on that vertical shaft chambers for the crew and for work areas and power plants. And obviously, this is a schematic. You could have 3 of those or 10 of those, depending on the depth of the facility and how big you wanted to make it. This is just the conceptual design. And then you see the tunnels coming down beneath the seafloor with the vertical features. Let me point this out. Those vertical features, I believe, are intended to be deep undersea, all-glass nuclear missile silos. Next slide, please. And this is why I say that. Because in John Pena Craven's book, to which I alluded about 5 to 10 minutes ago, Dr. Craven says that, of course, he worked with Edward Teller, and a lot of people in the military-industrial complex did. Edward Teller was the father of the hydrogen bomb, was very active in nuclear weapons development and deployment. And Teller wanted to make all-glass nuclear missile silos and bury them 20,000 feet deep in the seafloor. Why? This is counterintuitive, but at very great depth underwater, glass is tremendously strong structurally. And so it would make the best sense to build with glass very deeply. So I believe that those are glass missile silos. Could there be all glass missile silos buried deep underwater secretly? I don't see why not. We're seeing it depicted in this slide here, and we see it discussed by John Pena Craven in his book. Could they have done that? Could you have found several billion in that $2 trillion somewhere to do something like that? Of course. Next slide, please. So we've come back around to this Stanford Research Institute document, and you can see that you have a connection here between the China Lake Working Group and the Stanford Research Institute, which came out with these fairly elaborate plans to make dozens of these facilities on the seafloor, both in mid-ocean and on the continental shelves. Next slide, please. And in the Stanford Research Institute document, they went on to say that at that time, as of 1969, there weren't any deep-sea vehicles that could go down thousands of feet to mate with the lock of an in-bottom station. In other words, a manned facility actually in the ocean bottom. And that technology needed to be developed in order to make those facilities. Next slide, please. In other words, to make facilities, and this is another slide from Walter Kirshner, such as this. There you see submarines hovering around an airlock set in the ocean bottom. This is from 1968, the year before the document I just showed you from Stanford Research Institute. And then that vertical shaft straight down where you would have, I believe you'd have a high-speed elevator in there. And then you see the tunnel boring machine in the right-hand corner carving out a tunnel, excavating a tunnel. The radius of the tunnel is determined by the turning radius of the tunnel boring machine, which would be hundreds of feet long, by the way. These are very large machines. But here's a depiction of a deep-sea base in mid-ocean. Go ahead, please. Here's another example of another deep-sea base. You can see the airlock in the middle towards the top, and this would be a sonar array on the ocean bottom with the manned facilities down in the ocean floor. Go ahead, please. Now, I just showed you that the Stanford Research Institute said, we don't have this deep diving capability, but we need it in order to get these, build these undersea facilities we're discussing in these documents. Well, that was built. and deployed in the early 1970s, just 2 or 3 years later. This is a so-called DSRV, Deep Submergence Rescue Vehicle. And this is discussed by John Pena Craven in his book as well. He's saying, look, we needed this deep diving capability. We had to develop it. This is one of the vehicles they developed. They made 2 of them, ostensibly. But obviously, if you make 2 openly, what is he telling us in his book? You could have a whole fleet of them off of books. But you trot out 2 for the public. These 2 publicly are being retired. What do you do if you really want to hide something? You announce, oh, it's obsolete. We're getting rid of it. And the other 10 have never been made public. I assume they exist. I believe there probably are other vehicles like this. I'm not sure these are really being retired either. Just because there's an article in the newspaper saying something is so, doesn't necessarily mean it is so. But anyway, next slide, please. These things will carry 24 men. They'll dive 5,000 feet deep. That's a mile deep. At least that's what the open record says. For all I know, they go 10 or 15 or 20. But anyway, 5,000 is deep enough as far as that goes. They were built by Lockheed, launched in 1970. Look at the top. Here's a pressure lock that seals to submarine hatches. Well, you might also be able to seal to the hatch to an undersea base, too, as far as that goes. I'm just saying that, taking the document at its word, saying, you know, we can build 30 manned undersea bases for $2.7 billion. What's holding us back is the capability to take a crew down there and mate to the lock, to the airlock on an undersea base. The next year, they had that capability. It's no longer a problem. Go ahead, please. What I'm telling you is the technology exists to make these things. Back to John Pena Craven's book, The Silent War again. Interestingly, he says, the DSRV's technical sophistication, which we just looked at, and complexity surpassed the space vehicles of that day and perhaps of today. What is this man saying here? I don't know exactly. He's speaking in riddles, isn't he? This was a vehicle ahead of its time. Does he mean that literally? Was it a time travel machine? I don't know what he's saying. Or does he mean it in a metaphorical sense, that it was just, you know, cutting edge, high tech, more so than he can divulge? I don't know. We're in very uncertain territory here. With versatility still unpublicized, and he's writing this in the year 2000, and the potential to conduct missions not yet publicly articulated. Well, maybe I've given a little public articulation to what that mission might have been. I'm guessing I'm not too far off the mark. Go ahead, please. I'm guessing that this might be the mission that's not been publicly articulated by him. Go ahead, next slide, please. Here's another slide by Walter Kirshner, another example of where they would pull, or could pull, according to the design, multiple submarines into a facility. Now, large military submarines will have crews of hundreds of people in some cases. The larger ones, upwards of over 200 people, I believe, in some cases. And they'll be 400, 500, 600 feet long. They're huge. They're just enormous. So you can tell the size of these facilities. And there's 2 of them depicted here. 1968. This is what was planned in 1968. Go ahead, please. None of what I'm showing you is classified. I don't have any classified information. This is not declassified. This is Walter Kirshner giving me this stuff. Said, Richard, you're welcome to publicize this. So how do you power these undersea underground facilities? Next slide, please. I think there are 2 ways from what I've seen in the literature. Probably by nuclear power. I'm strongly guessing that nuclear power is used both in clandestine underground facilities and probably in the undersea facilities. And by the way, I give odds better than 50% that there are clandestine undersea facilities. I've just seen too much documentation planning for them by this time that I'm guessing they've gone ahead and done them. Go ahead, please. And also geothermal. Here's a document, by the way, also coming out of China Lake Naval Weapons Center, talking about the geothermal potential at U.S. Navy bases for power generation on base. Next document, please. Now, could this geothermal power generation extend to underwater bases too? Yeah. This is another illustration by Walter Kirshner for the same project, where they're explicitly talking about using a geothermal power plant to power an undersea base, in this case for petroleum extraction. Go ahead, please. Well, what do I think are some of the possible locations of undersea bases? I think high probabilities would be the Persian Gulf region, Gulf of Mexico, the North Sea. Those would be my first guesses. And the continental shelf of South America off of Argentina would be another guess for me. Other areas, possibly the Great Lakes, possibly the Chesapeake Bay region, and others. I don't rule out the mid-ocean. I think the technology is there to go way down. But those are some of my prime candidate locations from what I've seen. Go ahead, please. And the Bahamas. We've all heard of the Bermuda Triangle. I don't know if there's anything to that or not. I really don't. But I do know that on Andros Island in the Bahamas, the United States Navy has an undersea test and research center. Go ahead, please. It's right hard on what's called the tongue of the ocean, that fishhook, deep blue fishhook-like feature you can see in the center of the slide. Andros Island is right to the left, and Alltech is there. Go ahead, please. Here's an aerial view of Alltech. I think that tongue of the ocean area, as well as under Andros Island itself, would be a prime candidate for that type of facility. Go ahead, please. As well as the Channel Islands off the coast of California. This is Santa Catalina Island. Another illustration by Walter Kirshner. You can see coming down in the center, beneath the waterline, is a facility that's buried in the slope, in the undersea slope there. Go ahead, please. This is interesting to me because in Linda Moulton Howe's book, Glimpses of Other Realities, she cites the case of Linda Porter, who was abducted and shown by aliens a purported undersea facility which she alleges to have seen clearly buried in the bottom of the sea off the coast of Santa Barbara, California. Not far from Santa Catalina Island, not far at all. And this is where the Navy was planning to put an undersea facility. Did they do it? And is that facility manned in part or by whole by someone else? Or is manned the right word to use? Alien, maybe? I don't know. It raises a question. Go ahead, please. So just how long has all this been going on? Go ahead, please. Maybe a very long time, as I alluded to at the beginning. Maybe for centuries. Go ahead. I got this slide from the London Transport Museum just to give an idea of what you can do with technology almost a century old. All of this, if you ever use a tube in London, there's this whole warren, this maze of underground chambers and stairs and escalators, etc. And it was all excavated through that central shaft there you see in the left hand with a spiral staircase going down. That's an 18-foot diameter shaft. All of what you see was excavated through that 18-foot diameter shaft. What I'm telling you is, you can have a rather innocuous looking shaft, and you can say, it's an elevator shaft. Right. One elevator shaft will suffice to make something like that, and even much larger using today's technology. Go ahead, please. Out of sight, out of mind. In the 19th century, in the 1860s, Alfred Eli Beach, the editor of the Scientific American, go ahead, please, had a clandestine tunneling project in Midtown Manhattan. He went out at night from the basement of the department store, go ahead please, and made a steam engine powered, pneumatic driven subway car. If you've eaten at Subway sandwich shops, you've seen this on the side of the wall. This is from Scientific American from the 1860s, well, from 1870. And people did ride this. He made it secretly with his own funding in the middle of the night. The first black budget secret tunneling program in Midtown Manhattan using 19th century steam-powered technology. Try that on. Go ahead. So how long has this been going on? Maybe a long time. Go ahead, please. Go ahead, please. You've perhaps, like me, heard these stories of alleged secret underground high-speed tunnels that go coast to coast, supersonic. If they've been made, the tunnels could well have been made with a machine like this. Go ahead, please. And I assume the military has more than one. And may have used the Minovich design. Michael Minovich has patented this. It's a concept for a high-speed, very deeply buried tube transport system with magnetic suspension. The air would be drawn out of the tunnel, so you'd have a vacuum. So there'd be no wind resistance, no wind friction, no aerodynamic drag. You'd be suspended on magnets, so you wouldn't have any friction from wheels. And he's talking about hundreds of miles per hour. Gravity operated. The thing takes off, it goes down the slope, it accelerates to 500-600 miles per hour. When it gets to the destination, it comes back up slope and decelerates and cruises into the station where it stops. Go ahead, please. And then from the Office of High-Speed Ground Transportations in the 1960s, go ahead, please. There was this concept from Joseph Faure of a non-evacuated tube, 15 to 18 foot in diameter, about the diameter of a subway, up to 500 feet underground, going 1 to 2,000 miles per hour on a transcontinental scale. Go ahead, please. And this is what his vehicle looks like. Is something like that zooming along underground? I don't know. Here are the plans. Go ahead, please. All very highly strange. And I haven't given you any classified material at all. So if this is what you can get on from the open literature, non-classified, when you go beneath the surface, speaking literally here, not metaphorically, I'm willing to bet it could be even stranger yet. Go ahead, please. Characterization of underground facilities. Some of you may have heard of the Jason Group, Jason Committee. This report was published by the MITRE Corporation in 1999. Go ahead, please. And next slide, please. They went on to say in their report, underground facilities not only protect critical activities but also conceal them. Once built, it may be very difficult to determine the nature of the facility. What are they telling you? You build it and you do whatever you want in it, and no one will know. This isn't hard to figure out. And this report comes from the inside of the American military-industrial complex. You know, it's like nothing in a sense is being hidden. All of this is in the open if you look at it. As Jesus is alleged to have said, let those who have eyes to see, see. Have you seen what I've been showing you? Have you really thought about it? Let those who have ears to hear, hear. Have you heard what's been said? Go ahead, please. So we're down Alice's rabbit hole here big time. What is going on? Well, the stories I've heard have to do with, I can't tell you for a fact what I know of is going on underground, at least in part. Going down that list. Mind control, yes, I have some indications of mind control projects, at least in part being carried out underground, at least in some facilities. Shadow government, oh yeah, big time, no doubt about that. FEMA, Executive Office of the President, and others, no question. Corporate secrecy, huge. Oh, that's absolutely involved there. Weapon systems, of course. Neo-Nazi forces, yes. The paperclip scientists came here in large numbers after World War II. Some of them, including Werner von Braun personally, were involved in this. At one time, Werner von Braun was working out a Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. And there were plans, which I discuss in my first book, to make an underground missile factory beneath Green Mountain, which is just a few miles outside of Huntsville, Alabama. And when I first ran across that factoid, I wondered why. Now I understand, because that was in the 50s. You have to understand just 10 years earlier that Werner von Braun was building V-2 rockets for Hitler. And he was constructing them in the underground missile factory, the Mittelwerk factory in the Harz Mountains. And when I read that, I understood, aha, you know, he went from building missiles for Hitler to building missiles for Truman. And Truman told von Braun, look, whatever you did for Hitler, I want you to do the same thing for me. In fact, they brought as many of the V-2s as they could get to the United States. And when they ran through all of them, they started building another generation of rockets and ultimately ended up in the Saturn V rocket that went to the moon. But von Braun was involved in all of that. And when I read that, I understood, aha, he wanted to reproduce the same plant he built for Hitler, for Truman. He wanted to make in Alabama what he had made in the Harz Mountains in Germany 10 years earlier. Next slide, please. But before we go there, to the theme of this conference, could there be aliens underground? Oh, I think so. Can I prove to you that they're there? No. That's real hard to do. That's one of the hottest third rails on this planet. And I can't prove it. But what I can prove to you in spades is that there is a high degree of secrecy around this whole topic of underground and underwater facilities, and that a lot of planning, only a small part of which I've shown you this morning, has gone into that, and a lot of money. Could there be joint human-alien bases? I'm starting to think there could be. I can't prove it, but I definitely am open to that possibility. Is organized crime involved underground? Well, I think stealing trillions of dollars from the American people is a very organized crime. Next slide, please. And I want to mention briefly two cases, and then I got to clear out for the next speaker. James Walden wrote a book called The Ultimate Alien Agenda, and he alleges to have been abducted to a base underground in Kansas. He knows that because he was being examined by these alien creatures and looked around and saw a good number of human beings there in attendance as well. And the alien telepathically communicated to him, "You're in an underground facility beneath southeast Kansas." I think that could be true. Go ahead. But there are a lot of people who've popped up with these kinds of stories. This man is not the only one. I just mentioned him because I happened to recently read his book. But there are many others with these stories. I will say that it raises a question as to who or what really controls this planet and how deep the illusions go. I'm here to tell you I think the illusions go real deep, physically deep, as well as in a metaphorical sense. And I think the political illusion is real deep. I think the control is insidious and not in our best interest. And if anyone in this room is involved in these secret activities, I have to say, I'm sorry for you, number one. If you want to leave it, do. If you want to unburden your heart, you want to provide information to me or some other researcher here, please do. But please know, if you're operating this extreme secrecy, if you're involved in a program that's stealing trillions of dollars from people, don't you know that's wrong? Next slide, please. So finally, I'm just going to say, it is our right to know. Thank you for coming. Spread the information. Buy my books, please. You help fund my research further. I have a table. I'm at the table right outside the door. I'll be here all weekend. And thank you so much for coming.